The next major area of the world that we're going to discuss in terms of evidence for the origins of complex civilizations is the continent of South America. Here on this chronological slide you can see several different complex societies that we're going to discuss for South America. Now frequently we think of the Inca, but as we will see today, the Inca were just actually one of the more recent in a long progression of complex societies that developed in this part of the world. The societies that we're going to be discussing for South America primarily developed in the northwestern portion of that continent, along the Pacific coast and in the mountainous region of the Andes. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that the only civilizations in South America in ancient times developed in this part of the world. In fact, there is some suggestion that there may have been social complexity developing in the Amazon rainforest as well, but that hasn't preserved as well because of the different climatic conditions in these areas. So the region of our focus for this lecture is a diverse area of extremely arid Andean coastal regions. There are parts of the Pacific coast adjacent to the Andes Mountains where there has never been rainfall in recorded history, for example. And this leaves the landscape very open and not covered with plant life, and thus ancient archaeology tends to be well preserved in this very dry area. Along that dry Andean coast, however, there are also very rich fishing areas. Here you can see a photograph from the mid-20th century of some fishermen using traditional Andean coastal fishing boats. Now, above the arid coastline, there are not only the very high, jagged Andean mountains, but also high valleys and basins between the mountains, such as that around Lake Titicaca. Some of the highland areas, like the coast, are extremely arid, and as you can see in this photograph, ancient archaeological remains, such as foundations and wall lines and so forth, are well exposed in this region. And in fact, it was in some of these valleys, in particular the Viru Valley, that the technology and the techniques of archaeological survey were first really tested. So, like other parts of the Americas, South America appears to have been first colonized beginning during a period we call the Paleo-Indian period, or perhaps just before that. There are, in fact, a couple of archaeological sites that suggest there may have been people in South America as early as about 15,000 years ago, and we have a good record of them in multiple sites dating back to about 12,000 years ago. So the Andean pre-ceramic period, and you can see the dates here beginning about 10,000 years ago to about 4,000 years ago, include the development of a lot of domesticated animals and crops. Just as we've learned about in other parts of the world, South America was a region in which they not only developed a lot of their own domesticates, but they also ended up importing domesticates from Mesoamerica, for example. So some of the domesticates in the highlands include the guinea pig, which originally wasn't considered a pet, but in fact is still today eaten as a food. Llamas and alpacas, camelid animals that are used for pack animals and also are used for food, different squashes, quinoa grains, chili peppers, and then some other foods like maize were introduced from Mesoamerica by a little over 5,000 years ago. Other domesticates along the coast include things like cotton, and it's possible, there's new evidence suggesting that chocolate, that the plant from which chocolate is made, cacao, may have first been domesticated in South America and then was later exported and was used in Mesoamerica to the extent that it was so important some Mesoamerican groups actually used it as a currency. Now, sedentism and the establishment of permanent communities began somewhat after, probably starting around 6,000 years ago in coastal northern South America. And it's during that time that you see really early pottery develop in this region. Some of the earliest pottery in the Americas comes from the coast of Ecuador, for example, and is about 6,000 years old. And then we see the development of complex societies along that coastal region, beginning around 2500 before the Common Era, or 4,500 years ago. So here we can see some examples of these domesticates for which South America is famous. Here you got some llamas. Here you can see a group of women harvesting potatoes in the raised field agricultural system around Lake Titicaca in one of the highland valleys in the Andes. Now pay attention to this farming style of raised fields with canals of water running through it, because that was actually also a technology used often in Mesoamerica. Some of the first sedentary sites on the Andean coast are quite early for the New World. So for example, we can see here at the site of El Paraíso a small system of sites in this pre-ceramic period beginning around 2500 before the Common Era. And these sites were centered on huge artificial mounds. They likely had temples, and they may have included, in terms of social organization, some of this region's first chiefdoms. Here you can see some examples of the archaeology of El Paraíso, including just how dry this region is, and so how well exposed and preserved some of the architecture is on the landscape. And then in the lower left, you can see a plan view map of one of these large constructions. Now, a subsequent culture in Andean coastal South America is known as the Chavin culture, and the type site for that culture, after which the culture is named, is that of Chavin de Huántar. And you can see in this map, there's sort of a central core of Chavin culture, and then there's also a long stretch of the coastline across which Chavin had some kind of cultural influence. So the Chavin chiefdoms in the Andean highlands and along the coast began around 900 before the Common Era and lasted until around 200 before the Common Era. They were one of several chiefdoms developing kind of in the northern part of the Andes. And this is important. They were linked by a network of long-distance exchange. Now that network of long-distance exchange is going to be influential for the later Inca people. Now, in terms of iconography and shared ideas of the Chavin, we can see kind of a Chavin horizon style, which is to say iconography or types of art shared among these sites that suggest cultural cohesion among them. Now, some of these include some sort of bizarre otherworldly figures combining people and snakes and jaguar, as well as caimans, a kind of crocodile, and birds, along with intricate geometric designs. And in fact, pay attention to this hybridization between humans and animals, and between humans and jaguars in particular, as well as the really elaborate headgear seen on the figure to the left, and compare that to what we're going to see in Mesoamerica, because there are some interesting parallels here. So these shared styles seem to suggest also shared ideas. They may represent prestige goods and an emerging sort of Chavin ideological influence among these complex chiefdoms. And in my opinion, some of the art looks similar to that of the ancient Olmec from Mesoamerica. Some Chavin sites, including that at Chavin de Huántar, are also fortified with defensive structures that may suggest some conflict between communities at this time. Here you can see a photograph of a Chavin temple in a region that's slightly more verdant, slightly more green than some of the very most coastal occupations I've shown you so far. So far we've discussed some ancient chiefdoms in South America, but in fact there were also other state-level societies well before the rise of the famous Inca. One of these early states, known as the Nazca, dates to roughly 100 before the Common Era to 800 of the Common Era, so lasting nearly a millennium, starting about 2,000 years ago. And the Nazca, unfortunately, are really famous for shows like Ancient Aliens that tend to emphasize how difficult it would have been to make the giant geometric shapes that the Nazca people made on the landscape. Now, in the absence of evidence for UFOs helping the Nazca make this, I think the most realistic explanation is that these have to do with Nazca beliefs, Nazca ritual practices, Nazca culture, and in fact, in the region where the Nazca lines and the Nazca geometric shapes are produced, there is so much weathering of some of the stones on the surface that in fact all it takes is turning these stones over to expose their kind of white underside, and doing that in a geometric shape that may reveal some kind of imagery on the landscape. It's been suggested that the purpose of the Nazca lines was actually to form kind of a causeway, form a path for ritual processions, and that some of the Nazca lines could be seen from local hillsides. Some of the Nazca lines were made with very careful planning by someone who was organizing the imagery, and it's even been suggested that they may have been attempting to use something like a hot air balloon to produce these. There's not good evidence for that, but certainly just because we aren't sure how and why the Nazca made these lines doesn't mean that we should rely on aliens to understand them. So other pre-Inca civilizations of South America include the Moche, Tiwanaku, Wari, and Chimu societies. And we'll talk a little bit about these before we move on to discuss the Inca. And here you can see on this slide the chronology of those societies. So most of these are located along the Pacific coast of South America or somewhere in the Andes region, not far from that Pacific coast. And in fact, it was in part the establishment of these earlier state-level societies that allowed the later Inca to bring together a really large empire and use the ancient road systems that these previous societies had built. So the first of these to discuss here is the Mochica state. This slide is intentionally confusing. Look at all those different dates, because when I was researching for this lecture, I found lots of disagreement about exactly when the Mochica date to, but approximately 100 to 800 of the Common Era. They were located along the northern coast of Peru, and they appear to have used large-scale irrigation as the basis for their economy. In essence, they were converting the really dry, desertous Pacific coast into a green agricultural area. Now, this was a state ruled by a powerful leader, and we know that in part from a particular burial. The burial of the Lord of Sipan is one of the sort of most famous of the Mochica discoveries. The Lord of Sipan, which you can see here in this reconstruction, this burial includes many ritual offerings of vessels, as well as human sacrificial victims who have all been laid to rest around the king, the central person, in this tomb. And this really emphasizes the great social inequality of the Mochica state. Now, Moche iconography, including that found at Sipan, also suggests that there was a very hierarchical society here. So in this image, you can see a golden sort of plaque that has been produced with the king in the center. Check out the interesting nose plug, the fantastic headgear that the king is wearing, as well as what appears to be a necklace made out of skulls or shrunken heads or something, and also some kind of a weapon perhaps, and a shield. So this has led us to believe that a combination of warfare and ritual iconography has led us to believe that the nobles of the Mochica state, or of the Moche, were warrior priests, and that sacrifice was an important ritual. The Moche would sacrifice llamas and alpacas. They would also sacrifice war captives, and they did take and produce shrunken heads and trophy heads, and in some cases later jewelry, even that made out of turquoise or gold or something, would kind of symbolically refer to this tradition of trophy head taking. Other evidence that we have from the Moche include they're very realistic and beautifully made ceramic vessels. In this slide, you can see, for example, a famous Moche portrait pot, as well as the depiction of a warrior. And then something else the Moche are famous for is, you know, painted murals that show warfare taking place. In this image to the top, you can see all kinds of things happening with ritual vessels and probably conquest and a sacrificial victim being captured in the bottom area there. And then some of the Moche pottery is also famous for being sexually explicit, including showing some sexual activities that I didn't feel were appropriate to show in this slide. But if you are interested on your own time, go and do a Google image search for Moche iconography, and you'll see some amazing things that they were depicting in pottery. Now here in the Moche Valley, we can see some evidence for how Moche society was organized. For example, the large irrigation system, monumental construction, and standing armies were all produced by or incorporated large labor forces of people under the direction of the Moche elite. At the Huaca del Sol construction, we can see this large adobe brick building, which, along with some other constructions, formed the civic ceremonial center of this site, somewhat like a Mesopotamian ziggurat or an Egyptian pyramid. We have evidence here that these Moche sites were also conquering other nearby valleys. The Moche capital site seems to have declined after an earthquake and possibly an El Nino event about 500 of the Common Era, and that resulted in some changes of the Moche River that may have caused floods. Here you can see another image of just how massive the Huaca del Sol construction is. Now some parts of it look kind of like a natural hill because it's just adobe, so it's eroding. But you can see over to the left that this is an artificial construction that's been made by a massive labor force. Some later sites in the Andean region include Tiwanaku. Now these are some of the first empires or regional polities that began to conquer other polities and incorporate them, which is something that the Moche had begun to do, but we see more and more emphasized in Andean history over time. So here at Tiwanaku, we have an early empire along the lake shore of the Lake Titicaca Basin in Bolivia. Another one of these early complex societies that developed eventually into an empire is the Wari, which was in the Peruvian highlands. And if you notice, the artistic style of the Wari vessel that you can see in front of you looks very similar to some things we saw for the earlier Chavin culture. Another early empire in South America that predated the Inca is that of the Chimor or Chanchan. And here at this Chanchan site, you can see some evidence of their really unusual architectural style. Now, this kind of really elaborate mud brick construction would not be preserved in most other contexts, but here in this dry region of northern coastal Peru, it's preserved for centuries. So finally, after discussing kind of the roots and the background of complex civilizations in the coastal and mountainous Andes region, we can finally get to the Inca Empire. Now, while the Inca Empire is considered among the ancient civilizations discussed in this class, it's actually much more recent than some that we've discussed, and didn't last very long. It only lasted for a little bit less than a century before the arrival of the Spanish and before it eventually collapsed. So the Inca Empire as we know it, or Tawantinsuyu, was really not a culture, but rather a political entity bringing together conquered groups. There probably were never very many ethnically Inca people, but the ethnically Inca people began a process of conquering the other state-level societies in this part of the world and taking advantage of the constructions and roads and so forth that these previous societies had established. There were also some particular aspects of Inca cultural practice and belief that helped them to quickly establish a huge empire. Only lasting a century, the Inca Empire grew at an incredibly rapid rate. And one of the reasons for that is that each new Inca king, or Sapa Inca, needed to conquer his own lands in order to establish his own wealth. So you can see in this map with the color coding how different Inca rulers during their relatively short spans of rule conquered, in some cases, massive areas of land in order to establish their own sort of collection of wealth and lands and holdings. The Inca are famous for their architectural constructions. So this group that had begun as a small highland group in Peru and eventually began to conquer other groups around it over less than a century, and defeated the rival Timur society in the 1460s, eventually established the largest empire in the pre-Hispanic Americas, stretching from Colombia and all the way down to Chile along the Pacific coast, from mountains to jungles, incorporating a rulership of up to 6 million people under ultimately a single Inca ruler. So the architectural style, which is one of the kind of iconic things about the Inca, is famous in part because the Inca were able to construct incredible buildings using expertly cut, customized stone blocks that in most cases were not even fitted with any kind of mortar or adhesive, but were rather just closely fitted together. And these have survived for centuries, even in a part of the world with lots of earthquakes. And even when more recent buildings built by the Spanish Empire or by later modern societies have collapsed. Now, the capital of the ancient Inca society was at Cusco. This was the capital of the state. Cusco still has some remnants of its boulder masonry architecture. Just outside the city is the famous Sacsayhuaman fortress, which was one of the homes of the Inca rulership. And here you can see some modern descendants of the Inca and a photograph from the air of modern Cusco. Now, some of what we know about the Inca actually comes from a very long letter, actually more like a book, that was written by a native scribe and sent to the Spanish king. And unfortunately, the book, which was basically beseeching the king for better treatment of the indigenous peoples, the book never arrived to the Spanish king, but we were able to study it now. I believe it was discovered in a library somewhere. And this 17th century text, which was written after the Spanish arrived, nonetheless records many of the Inca practices that were commonplace before the arrival of the Spanish. So it's from this book in part that we understand, for example, how the Inca agricultural system worked and how they would plant with this foot plow. Now, in addition to some rare preserved texts, in part because parts of the Inca Empire were so dry, we also have some examples of preserved textiles of the Inca. Sometimes these are found in special offerings. Sometimes they're actually found with mummies discovered in the Andes region, where they're essentially freeze-dried. And these textiles were actually the greatest wealth of the Inca Empire. The Inca didn't value gold as highly as the Europeans did. They didn't value greenstone as highly as the Mesoamericans did. Real wealth for the Inca was in the form of textiles, to the extent that in some cases conquest of a new region by an Inca ruler could be established by essentially giving the local rulership obligatory gifts of valuable textiles that then sort of put them into a situation of indebtedness that allowed the Inca to begin to conquer them. In terms of Inca architecture, as we discussed earlier, this is dry-laid masonry, which means it didn't need, in most cases, any kind of mortar, as you would see between modern bricks. These were finely carved, finely shaped by expert craftspeople and fit kind of like jigsaw puzzles. And, for example, one sort of legend about Inca architecture is that you can't fit the blade of a knife between most of these stones. And actually, in many cases, that's true. So this has resulted in some extremely durable walls in this earthquake-prone zone. And one of the best examples of this can be seen at the royal fortress of Sacsayhuaman right outside the Cusco capital city. So here you see a person for scale at the Sacsayhuaman fortress near the capital city of Cusco. And note, for example, some of the giant boulders that have been carefully cut and sanded into place and fit together almost like jigsaw puzzle pieces or locks and keys, such that they don't actually need mortar to hold them together. Here's another shot, unfortunately without scale, but it's still a beautiful picture of some of the remarkable masonry at Sacsayhuaman. Here's an additional shot of the walls at Sacsayhuaman with what might be a person or a llama for scale in the background, just to demonstrate how massive, I mean Volkswagen-sized, some of these boulders are that were fitted together by hand. Now, in terms of the social organization that supported the expansion of the Inca Empire, one of the fascinating aspects about it is how rulership was justified. So for the Inca, the ruler was referred to as the speaker of the dead, or the Sapa Inca, or unique Inca. And this ruler was considered, this paramount king, was considered essentially a god on earth, which we've only seen in a couple of other societies. You might compare it to ancient Egypt, for example. And the reason for this establishment of being a god on earth was that the king was considered a descendant of the sun. So the Sapa Inca, this Inca ruler, was considered a direct descendant of the sun god and therefore a deity on earth, and was so wealthy that they could be carried around the empire in a litter. They didn't have to walk on the ground if they didn't want to. But there were some interesting sort of factors to Inca rulership, and one of them was that a king never inherited wealth from his ancestors. Rather, every new king had to go out and establish their own land holdings, which was kind of the equivalent of wealth, the product of those land holdings. And so that drove, from a philosophical standpoint, that kind of approach to wealth for the nobility drove the extremely rapid expansion of the Inca Empire. In fact, many scholars think that the Inca Empire expanded too quickly, thus kind of weakening it and essentially putting them in a precarious position when the Spanish arrived. So in terms of the social strata of the Inca Empire, we have the supreme ruler that we've talked about, and the male sort of heirs of the Incas' bloodline, including sons and grandsons, as well as other royal relatives, and then some sort of like lower nobles, and finally conquered peoples and peasants and so forth at the bottom of the social ladder. Now, one of the most famous of Inca sites, Machu Picchu, was actually not an Inca city. This was never really an Inca occupation. Rather, this was more like an Inca noble retreat where the elites could go and leave the hustle and bustle of the capital city of Cusco and take their sort of retinue of followers and attendants and wealth and so forth with them, and occupy this really high kind of hidden highland escape as part of their royal wealth. And in fact, Machu Picchu wasn't discovered by Westerners until centuries after the arrival of the Spanish, just demonstrating how well hidden it is. This really wouldn't be a practical place to have a city. It would be very hard to support in terms of agriculture. There's hardly anywhere to grow fields. It would be really hard to get enough drinkable water here for a full functioning community. So this was almost more like a vacation home of the Inca rulership than it really was a city. Nonetheless, the images of Machu Picchu are breathtaking, and I've heard that if you set up time-lapse photography equipment at the site, you often get curious llamas like this one exploring what you're up to. In this photograph, you can see that some of the hillsides, the mountain slopes around Machu Picchu have been terraced for limited agricultural productivity, but really there just wouldn't be enough acreage and not enough water and so forth to support a permanent community at this site. Rather, it was more of a retreat for the nobility. Now, the constructions in the Andes Mountains that the Inca were able to complete, including the terraced mountain slopes and including the incredible road system, really were one of the great accomplishments of this society. They helped to tie together the empire itself. And in fact, the Inca didn't make all of these, but rather made many of them, but also incorporated roads and terraces built by other societies going back millennia in the Andes mountain range. A map of the Inca road system, which incorporates their own constructions and those of previous complex societies, demonstrates how they were able to maintain communication and exchange across this vast ancient empire. The Inca roads traversed everything from the highest of Andean mountain peaks to the dry desert coastal areas. And much like in ancient Greece, there was a tradition of running messengers who would carry information back and forth across the empire. Now, one of the last major components of Inca society that I want to discuss is one that has a lot to do with how and why the empire spread as quickly as it did and became so large in just a century. For the Inca, as I've mentioned before, the new Sapa Inca, each new Inca king, needed to accumulate his own wealth, needed to conquer his own lands in order to establish his sort of royal coffers, or his royal wealth. And the reason for that, in part, was because the Inca kings were so sacred, so powerful, so holy, that they actually didn't lose power when they died. So this tradition of being descendant from Inti, the sun god, maintained a sense of power, a sense of even political dominance for the Inca rulers after death. So this can be seen in the tradition of the Inca mummy cult. In the Inca society, a former king, a dead king, would be carried around on a litter as a mummy bundle. And in some cases, these mummy bundles would actually be placed together in a special, basically a house, so that they could communicate with one another. They were considered to be still rulers even after death, and they maintained their wealth after death, which is why the descendants had to go out and accumulate their own wealth. So this tradition of the Inca mummy cult, of the Inca rulers maintaining power and wealth after death, actually became a great point of contention in Inca society. Shortly before the Spanish arrived, our understanding, our history of the Inca includes that two brothers who were sort of fighting over the right to ascend to the throne were in part also fighting over the tradition of the mummy cult. Famously, one brother wanted to maintain the mummy cult and continue to grow the empire, and the other brother felt that this tradition of having to continuously expand the empire was actually weakening the empire, was making it so that they constantly had to put down revolts in their growing territory, and was leaving them susceptible to collapse and even potentially invasion from outside. So unfortunately for the Inca, they were essentially kind of tied up in a civil war over these rights of inheritance when the Spanish arrived. So just to give a few more quick facts about the Inca Empire, this was the largest ancient empire in the New World of over 1 million square kilometers, controlling much of the Pacific coast, incorporating a massive road network of over 30,000 miles of roads, with potentially a population, and remember this was an ethnically diverse population, largely of conquered peoples, of over 1 million people, of whom just a few, just a tiny percentage, were actually ethnically, quote-unquote, Inca, but also incorporated 80 conquered provinces and with this massive standing army. Nonetheless, in part because the empire was weakened due to constant revolt and constantly needing to conquer new lands, in part because the empire was weakened over the civil war that had developed related to the mummy cult and the inheritance of wealth and power among the Inca nobility. When the Spanish arrived, shortly after the Spanish arrival in Mexico, when the Spanish arrived to South America, their timing was such that the empire was weakened, and this led to a conquest and a long tradition of colonial rule by the Spanish in much of the Americas, including South America. And it's also worth noting that this didn't mean the end of the native peoples. There are still many native peoples in what was formerly the Inca Empire. So I think this leads us to some questions to discuss for the class overall, and they have to do with, this class has been focused largely on how civilizations come to be, but I think our example of the Inca Empire and even our examples of Spanish conquest in Mesoamerica lead us to question what are the things that cause civilizations to collapse. These might be quite varied depending on different contexts, different parts of the world. It could have to do with people using up their resources, with the society not really being sustainable. It could also have to do with things that are nobody's fault but are just natural calamities. It could have to do with a combination of these things where maybe environmental changes are occurring and the society is not able to adapt sufficiently. It could have to do with competition with other complex societies, and I think you could see in the case of the Inca Empire, it might be a combination of multiple factors here. It could have to do with invasion as well as internal problems and an inability to maintain a growing infrastructure. And I think it's worth considering that maybe no one of these factors works in all places, but rather we need historical context to understand the degree to which different factors played into the collapse of complex societies.